Welcome back. Um, Today I'm going to talk about standard scores and kind of some basics around descriptive statistics. Now, many of you, I'm sure, will have had statistics, a full course of it before. And so the point of this course is not to really cover statistics in any great way, but I do want to touch on a few things because I know some of you may not have that background. So if you are really very comfortable with, when I get to the section on mean, median, and mode, if you're very comfortable with that material, you may well be able to skip by it. So let's get started. In your book, towards the back of your book, you'll find this diagram. And what this shows is it's a cross-reference between many different kinds of standard scores. And so I would encourage you to stop or pause the video right now and locate this in your book. It was on page 494 of the 9th edition. I'm not sure what page it is in the 10th edition. You might want to just, like I said, stop, take a look for this, have it out in front of you, because as I talk about percentile scores, stay nines, standard scores, z-scores, t-scores, and all of these other sorts of ways that we can describe in relative performance or normative performance how well or how poorly someone did. This is a very handy chart to get you from point A to point B. So standard scores in the normal curve. One of the technical challenges is that our measures that we use are not like a weight scale, and they're not like a ruler. There isn't really a precise or real measurement for any of the things that we look at. In fact, we're making an inference or an interpretation of the information that we have in front of us. Our units of measurement are not equal. Is 3 items right 3 times better than 1 item right? Or is it just simply different? By using standard scores, this gives us a meaningful frame of reference, and it gives us the ability to standardize or to make in equal intervals the performance of individuals or children, in our case, on a variety of different kinds of measures. It also gives us a way to compare and add very different kinds of measurements. So, for example, we could look at aptitude in welding, and we could create a standard score of someone's performance in that task, and we could do the same for water skiing. Now, you might ask, why are we going to compare water skiing and welding? Well, you wouldn't do that, but it's equally problematic to compare things like writing performance and mathematical computation. They're not at all the same tasks, and often we find that children who are good on one aren't necessarily good on the other. What we need is the ability to say, relative to the larger population, how well did somebody do on a particular type of a test? So whether it's the writing test or the welding test or the water skiing test, all of them require that we have a way to contextualize or to normalize our inferences or our understanding about what a child has done. Okay, so the professional standard that this addresses is that teachers should be able to interpret commonly reported scores, such as percentile ranks, percentile band scores, standard scores, and grade equivalents. And this is standard 3 for teacher competence in educational assessment. So if one asks, well, why would we spend time looking at this topic? It's a critical topic because as teachers, especially in this age of accountability, you're presented on a regular basis with scores from a variety of different kinds of tests and instruments. Now it's interesting, I was just at a meeting yesterday, or 2 days ago actually, with a local superintendent and talking about how to interpret the results of a large test that they had given to all of the students in their district. And although the test manufacturer provides all of this data and all of this information, it was much more difficult for them to decide how they were going to actually make use of that data. How were they actually going to explain the performance of individual children as well as the performance of their schools and their district to the public? So this isn't a problem that is removed from reality. This is, in fact, one of the challenges of being a teacher is facing your parents or facing other teachers, or even in explaining to students how well they did or how poorly they might have done, and being accurate and fair in the way that you're interpreting that information. Neither do you want to be dismissive about these test scores, nor do you want to scare children or parents into over generalizing the importance of these scores and thinking that because their child got a very good score or got a very poor score, that this is sort of a blanket statement about their ability one way or the other. So, there are a number of different ways to interpret test scores. One of them is the raw score. And raw scores are just simply the number of correct answers or correct points that someone has accumulated on a test. Raw score has no inherent meaning. If you get 43 right, is that good? Is that bad? We have no idea. If you get 90% right, is that good or is that bad? Again, we have no idea. Now, on the second one, some of you may be saying, well, 90% right, that sounds very good. Well, 90% right, if it's a reading test for developing readers, is actually the lower threshold of the degree of accuracy that you would hope to have. Children who are reading with less than 90% accuracy are really struggling to read a passage. You would probably want to see something more like 97, 98, 99% correct on that particular test. So it all depends. As students, we became so accustomed to the idea of getting a certain percent grade because all of our grades were contextualized into the idea that 90% or 92% was an A, getting 70% was bad. All of that is completely arbitrary, and I would encourage you as teachers, especially those of you that are currently practicing teachers, to stop and reflect on the arbitrary nature of the percentage scale for which we assign particular letter grades. Right, we're going to come back to this more, but there is no inherent meaning in the percent correct or the raw score. So, criterion reference and standards-based interpretations. One thing that we want to take a look at is the idea that we're not measuring the percent correct, we're not measuring how many you got right, but rather we're trying to estimate whether or not a child has developed a particular skill, or whether or not a child or a group of children are doing as well as or better than other kids their same age or in their same situation. So, a couple of definitions. One, we're looking at student scores as it relates to a clear description of a specific task that student can perform. That's that criterion referenced outcome. Can the student write a 5-paragraph essay with the following components? Okay, those tasks in turn are related to the specific standards of mastery that we think are important. So, for example, if we look in the main learning results and we look at some particular performance indicators, what we find are very specific examples of performances. Now, some of you may remember trying to write local assessments that measured those specific performance indicators. And I don't think that was ever the intention of the main learning results. However, it did build a lot of interesting assessments, some good, some not so good. But what they did have was a degree of wanting to show that children could perform a particular outcome or task. Of course, the question really came in whether that outcome or that task was really important. In this case, if we look under item C, there's no need to consider other students' scores. So when we think about a criterion outcome, criterion reference and standards-based interpretations are really useful in saying our students can or they cannot do certain tasks. When we see, in a moment, when we see the norm-referenced kinds of outcomes, we have to make a whole different set of assumptions and interpretations. Some of you probably recall the local assessment system and the original call that all Maine students would need to show competency on a whole series of outcome criterion, mostly the learning results, and then the competency tests or the local assessments that districts would design to show that students had learned this information. So the concept there being that if a student could show that they could write the 5-paragraph essay, if the student could show that they could solve the 2-by-2 multiplication problems, if the student could show that they could do this whole series of tasks, then that was evidence that they had mastered the learning results and that they could get this learning results kind of enhanced diploma. Criterion reference and standards-based interpretations are really most useful when your test is designed for the purpose of this. You have to have a very clearly delineated set of learning objectives. If your learning objectives are vague, if they are unmeasurable, if they are loosely formed, or if they are too cross-cutting, in other words, they go across too many different discrete kinds of skills, it's going to be very difficult to measure these things with any kind of precision. This is the problem, of course, with measuring something that is a synthesized skill like writing, where it's very difficult to say what is good writing, what isn't good writing. What we wind up doing is we pick apart discrete elements of writing and we determine whether or not those things have been performed well or not. But that doesn't necessarily reflect a good piece of writing in total. We have to have enough different examples of the students' work to feel confident that we've really proven that they can do it. So I'll give you a good example from my own history. When I first began graduate school, I had to sit and write the GRE, and I took it online, and I found that a really interesting experience. It was an adaptive test. We'll talk about what CATs are, or computer adaptive tests. The version that I took was a CAT, but it also included, of course, the writing section, and it was interesting. I had just finished doing, not too long ago, my master's in special education. I had to sit and write the GRE for my doctoral program. And when I was given a question, the question that I was given was to describe the impact of the inclusive school, the inclusive education movement in special education on the general education classroom. Now, I don't know if it was just sheer luck or it was based on the fact that I had had a previous degree in special education that I was given this particular topic. But ironically, I had just finished really writing a major paper on that precise topic. So when I received this question, I was really greatly relieved because I felt very confident about answering it, and was able to write really a very thorough essay. It was well documented. It even had references in it, and I could cite the author and the year of the papers and so on. Now, most people that sit for that GRE probably don't get that experience. So although it was a criterion reference assessment, in other words, they were looking for particular characteristics and qualities of my writing. My writing example that day was an overestimation of how good a writer I am. I'm not that great a writer. I'm an okay writer. But I wound up getting a great score because of constructor-relevant variance, which was really luck. Luck that I had gotten the topic that I happened to know a lot about. It ties back to this problem here in that there was just the single prompt. They have the single prompt, and you write a major essay, and then there's a second prompt, but there aren't very many. And I overperformed. Other people probably got a question where they underperformed. They just knew nothing about the question, and it was still kind of luck that they happened to know a lot or they happened to know very little. By having only one example of that writing sample, that constructor-relevant variance, which really is the idea that they were trying to measure my writing ability, and in fact what they were measuring was my content knowledge, really got in the way of making an accurate estimation of my writing. So similarly, when we give students a single task and we weight a lot of weight on it and there's no opportunity for them to rectify their grade or to redo the assignment, that's really problematic from a reliability standpoint and also from a construct irrelevant variance possibility where we have a single item or a single task that doesn't appeal to students. We also have to have items that actually measure the domain that we seek to measure. And that seems patently obvious, but in fact, there's a lot of examples, I think, where we pick something that is supposed to measure, say, writing, like my example that I shared with you. But in fact, it wasn't really measuring my writing, it was measuring, in a lot of ways, my ability to regurgitate all of that paper that I had recently written and worked so hard on to refine and develop. So it was probably unforeseen that that would happen, but the item that they chose didn't actually measure the domain of writing as well as they had hoped it would. We need to have guidelines for when one can cautiously interpret a norm reference test in a criterion reference term. So one of the controversies that we've recently had in Maine, and it's settled out more in the last year or so, is the adoption of the SAT as our state assessment for high school. The SAT, of course, is a norm reference measure, and the states combine that with a second component of the SAT, which is the augmentations for math and for science. And what we find is that taken together, we have a broader measure of kids' outcomes. But even with the augmentation, the SAT is still itself a selected response test that is designed to measure in a normative fashion. In other words, comparing students not to some particular outcome, but trying to sort them against the larger group of students that are taking the test, sort their performance out as being average, below average, or above average. There are some requirements, really, or suggestions around how one should use a norm reference test like the SAT, for example, in a criterion reference way. For example, the first is, what are the achievement domains that are measured by the norm reference test? Are they homogeneous? Are they all relatively similar? Are they delimited specifically to what the achievement outcomes should be, achievement objectives? And are they clearly specified? If they're not, it's very difficult to say that students have a level of mastery around specific content objectives. For example, we could administer the calculation portion from the quantitative portion from the SAT, and we could make inferences about how good those students were in math compared to other students. But we couldn't necessarily say whether they had mastered particular algebra concepts or they had mastered particular geometry concepts. Unless we can disaggregate, or in other words, we can report out by content clusters the performance of those kids on that test. And in fact, for the first several years that Maine used the test, we couldn't report out by content clusters. There simply weren't enough items in the test, and this goes to point C on here, although my lettering I can see is kind of crazy. It goes from A to C. But there aren't enough items in the SAT in each performance area to allow us to make good inferences or solid and reliable inferences about whether or not children have mastered, in a criterion reference sense, mastered particular kinds of content. So if we're going to use a test like the SAT, we really have to augment it. The state has done that. There's still a lot of questions surrounding the usefulness of the SAT as a criterion reference measure. It's still a fairly controversial topic. I'm going to kind of stay neutral on it here and say that it's something to continue to watch and to see how it's received at the national level and to see how Maine continues to use it as their measure for the learning results. Another couple of points. Were easy items omitted to increase the discrimination? And what we see on a test like the SAT is that it's designed to sort kids out. It's designed to be difficult. If you have a lot of easy items on a test like the SAT, you're going to wind up needing to have a much longer test, because in order to sort kids out, if you have all college-bound kids who are fairly talented taking the test to start with, and you include a series of quite easy items, then you're going to have essentially no variance. And we learned that when we talked about reliability, that reliability really depends, at least in part, on the variance in scores. So if all children get an item right, for example, it's as if that item didn't exist in your test. So the SAT is by design put together to make sure that the items are of adequate difficulty, that at least some of the students are going to get that item wrong. A healthy proportion of the students will get that item wrong. And very few items in the test are designed such that nearly all or all of the students would get that item correct. In fact, if an item performs that way on the SAT, it's often thrown out of the test. There's really no value in an item where everyone got it right. It really doesn't have an influence on the scores. So the problem for this as a state test, of course, is that we have a lot of low-performing students that are required to take the test because all students engage in the process. And so as a result, the easy items that would have been in a regular state test aren't present in the SAT. Now, more of those items are present in the augmented versions of the test that are given on the alternate Saturday. But what we find is that there is a disproportionate number of kids who take the SAT portion of the test, and they earn what's called the floor score. In other words, they essentially got nothing correct because the items, most or all of the items, were too difficult for them, and they perhaps didn't do any better than they might have by guessing alone. Another issue, and I mentioned this before, is whether or not the test uses only selected response kinds of items. And as I just said, the scores are influenced by guessing. Of course, the scores for the SAT are control for guessing. So in essence, you start out with the test with the probability that you're going to get 25 or 20%. In the case of the SAT, most of the items have 5 options. You start out with the premise that you're going to get 20% correct. And so there are, of course, children who get fewer than 20% correct, or students that get fewer than 20% correct on the SAT because they had bad luck. They not only were guessing, but they chose the wrong items and got even less than what you would expect them to get right. So the last point I've got here is, do the test items provide directly relevant measure of the objectives that you're seeking? And so, of course, the SAT was not written to measure the main learning results, so it doesn't directly measure those things. And what we find is that there are a number of different folks that have differing opinions about whether it's a good enough estimation. I'm going to leave that up to you to decide and to reflect on. I guess one of the questions that I would have would be, does the SAT really measure, and does it satisfy these 5 different areas that I've just talked about? And that is, if we go back to the last slide, does it have a homogeneous achievement domain? Does it have enough items for each content cluster? Does it have easy items? And does it use only selected response type items? And then finally, does it have content that is a direct measure of the main learning results? And I'll leave you to your own conclusions about whether it does or it doesn't. So, norm reference tests, this is the second section here, and I'm going to begin this, and then I'm going to pause the video, and I'm going to split the video actually right here to put this into 2 or 3 different sections so that we don't have any of the sections more than about 15 minutes. So we'll pick up right here with the next section of this, and look forward to finishing up with you.